I don't know if there's a stigma necessarily to digital manga art, but relative to the traditional, I'm retarded. But relative to regular manga, it's at least seen as easier or less respectable overall. When people started to notice Berserk was tapping into digital art a little bit, for some reason people saw that as controversial. I didn't even know and still can't really tell the difference, and I don't think anyone really cares either. The art is still immaculate. Digital is probably easier than hand-drawn manga art, but it's not easy work. If you suck ass with a pencil, you're not going to turn into a god going digital. If there really is anything to complain about, it being digital, even though it lightens the load of the authors and their assistants, while maintaining their quality, helping them produce more, and avoid work-related health problems, show Anyone Innocent by Shinichi Sakamoto and they'll shut up. In total, it has 99 chapters. If this is your first time hearing about it, guess how long it took Sakamoto to release them all. Starting in January of 2013, Innocent hit 99 chapters in April of 2015. He was releasing Innocent at that quality weekly, and then from May of that year, he started a sequel that goes on for 88 more chapters. This is what happens when somebody really talented goes fully digital. Sakamoto could probably do it all again on paper, and it would still look as good, but he's not doing it in a 2-year time span. If he wanted to be optimistic and say he does it on paper monthly, and even that's really unrealistic, I'm not gonna lie. That's 8 years and a quarter. Realistically, it's more like a decade as a lowball. There's a documentary up on YouTube I recommend, where Sakamoto shows how he maximizes his drawing output the way he does, where Sakamoto shows his whole process of being a digital artist. Besides Innocent being a manga that shows the potential of the digital medium, it's only one of 4 historical manga I've read. Villain made it more popular recently as a genre, but there's really only a few that get talked about at all. The ones I have read are Vagabond, Kingdom, Villain, and Innocent, and that's basically all the surface level ones, so even I really don't know all of them. It might be the most niche genre to break into. Every other genre has a template you could at least choose to go by, or flip on its head. And for historical manga, the plot is already there, but the way you tell it in a manga is open-ended. Kingdom telling a story through war documents, when China was in its warring period, is completely different from Vagabond, where a lot of it is from his personal books. It's not easy retelling a historical person, and having it be your own work at the same time. It's a fine line between keeping it accurate and adding your own original flair. Plus you gotta pace it as an actual story, and not just naming off events going through the motions. If the person's personality is vague and the records about them, that leaves space for you to make them any way you want, but it still has to fit with how they lived. Like if Musashi was really into cooking, that would be really off brand for, what he's known for. The French Revolution has a lot of documentation, books, documents, art, and there's a lot of people you could tell it through. But instead of an individual, Sakamoto told it through the Santon family's POV, the executioners in that whole revolution time frame. Sakamoto covers most of the family, but the main members he focuses on are Mary and Charles, the first female executioner and the fourth, Monsieur de Paris. Yeah, I fucked up that pronunciation. People back then were retarded. I mean, you can't blame them, but they're still retarded. People thought there was a difference in blood between the estates, the third being common blood, and the first and second having blue blood. And since the Santons were professional killers, the rumor spread that if you touched them, you would die. Even though they had status, Charles was kicked out of any school he enrolled in, because of what his family is known for. Sometimes he would find somebody who didn't know who he was, and for a moment, he could escape the family he was tied to, and have a normal friendship, but he always got reality checked in the most brutal way possible. From early childhood to early adulthood, Charles was in a back and forth struggle between his own sense of self and the identity he had from his lineage. Mary grew up in a whole other part of their mansion. She didn't have to learn how to butcher people and get used to the smell of rotting flesh, but she had her own set of burdens from the family. Mary was a girl, so the family had no plans of her being an executioner. All they wanted from her was to grow up, build their network, get married and fuck off. But by some really twisted luck, Mary ended up really wanting to be an executioner. All her free time went to dissecting stuff, reading books on the anatomy, everything that went into executing executions. Out of all the children, she was the most ideal to become an executioner. Whenever she could talk with Charles freely, She would make him teach her what he knew about executing. They spent a lot of time together, but they did not fuck with each other. Mary glorified executions, and Charles hated them actually, surprisingly. They reflected the parts they hate about themselves. Mary doesn't like the fact that she was born a girl, or more specifically, she doesn't like the limitations she has as a girl. Charles is the more feminine between the two of them. He kept reminding her of that reality, and the other way around, she was a reminder he wasn't built to be an executioner. But the family rejected both of them, so they had no other choice but to rely on one another. Their duality reflected the beauty and fucked up nature of the kind of lives they would lead. A rotten apple coated in sugar.
Might be giving yourself credit for it. If you have something that's going on in your life right now that's challenging, painful, it's just a reminder to take a little bit better care of yourself. Because you're worth it. You can have this feeling anytime you choose.
One of the things I noticed Sakamoto was really good at was blending fantasy with reality. And it would warp the tone of that act or item, and what feelings you associate it to. Innocent has a copious amount of sexual expression. I wouldn't consider it fan service though. Usually it's either annoying, wholesome, and if you're really lucky, it might be good. But every sex scene in Innocent is meant to be unsettling, unless you're into some weird shit. For a second you forget you're looking at people smashing, when the driving force of the act is manipulation, anxiety, anger, and greed. Versailles by design is the best looking place in the whole manga. It's a self-made Eden for the nobles of France. Only behind the execution platform itself, it's the most suffocating location that you see in detail. It's a political battlefield, with everybody trying to devour each other. It's like France's own Twitter. They built their Eden on the other 98% of France suffering. To anyone who could afford it, perfume was a popular item. But after the king's execution, and no, that's not a spoiler, you had 230 years to know that. But yeah, after he died, any luxury was spun to be against the new government. So if you were a jeweler or perfumist, you were put out of business for having business with nobles. From associating the smell of violets with innocent, wholesome friendships, with hope for a better future, to associating violence with that innocence being manipulated, and eventually, death. Sakamoto could flip the meaning behind any person, landmark, quote, before you realize it was in that transition. That accounts for about 1% of the manga. That's just a sample of Innocent's story. The imagery to show these realities manifests in the weirdest but coolest combinations. After the royal family failed to escape the country, Mary, this Mary by the way, there's two of them, was put in prison waiting for her trial. The cooler Mary went to visit her and give her an ultimatum. Drink the unfiltered water commoners are forced to use, and she'll help her see her kids again. And Sakamoto could have just shown it as it is, and that would have been more than fine. But he turned it into a high school drama subplot. I almost skipped over it because I thought it was filler, but it parallels what was going on so strongly that it somehow worked. The way Sakamoto uses imagery, it adds more life into the events and ideas that make them feel bigger than life. The guillotine creating a pool of blood that floods Paris, a kaiju-sized king made up of commoners, and the royal family having a discord. One of the first executions, Ecart Element, the one that hurts a lot. For that imagery element, Sakamoto showed it through musical notes of a violin. When you have that parallel, you take note that you can't read music for shit. But I do know that for every string that snapped, the person being executed had their limb torn off. Hearing manga is something you experience very few times. Even as a top-rated manga author, it's hard to just tap into that. It's one of the weak points of manga, relative to the digital medium. Whatever's going on has to be some ethereal shit, cause you don't just hear manga. But Innocent was one of the few mangas to break that sound barrier. From the crowd crying out of fear and excitement of the execution, to it being drowned out by a hoarse cry, from being poked out with a hot iron, the sound of rope tensing up, and seeing small fibers snap, to then this classical music engulfing the entire scene with this rich, clean sound, until a string snaps, and in response, an ear-piercing scream from dismemberment. and with each string snapping, you bounce between being disturbed and in awe. Sakamoto's obsession with making his work as realistic as possible gives the reader huge payoffs. Maybe it's just for his particular style, but I never knew how much manga artists use references for their drawings until I saw his process. Looking back on it, drawing the human anatomy straight off human memory does sound a little crazy. Especially when your goal is realism, you're gonna need real-life reference points, either through photos or 3D renders. But Sakamoto took it even further. To be as close to the real thing as possible, similar to the fashion at that time, he would have his editors dress and pose in them, for accurate body poses in those type of clothing. Small little details you wouldn't even think about, like the wrinkles on an arm sleeve, are from taking dozens of photos and doing tons of research before they even start drawing. Innocent is truly a manga of all time. The art, story development, being historically accurate, but no manga is perfect, and Innocent had its own imperfections. Even though it's a story with two main characters, eventually Mary ends up overtaking Charles, and ends up way more interesting. Charles is the one more shackled with real life history. His development was a lot more linear. There's nothing about the real Mary Stanton, so Sakamoto had a lot more creativity with her character. It's not a bad thing exactly, and it's not like Charles became irrelevant, but Mary's just way more likable as a character. Charles was the one to drive the story, and Mary was the one to keep spinning the story on his head. I did not know who Sakamoto was until a week ago, but right after this, I plan on reading his new Dracula manga, and The Climber. I don't like to rank manga, because what I prefer is always changing, plus most manga just aren't comparable. But Innocent is top, like, the highest. It's fucking good. I recommend. It's the 18th century, 1789. The first estate general is being held in 160 years. A meeting between the three estates of France to discuss political issues. Allegedly being locked out of their meeting hall, the third estate went to a nearby tennis court to declare an oath to never disband until France had written its own constitution, similar to that of America, only 2 years prior. Down the block, there's a 20-year-old Napoleon quietly shitting himself. And by the way, yeah, it is at Napoleon. And even further down the block, in the middle of a duel, there's a baby sitting and laughing in a basket full of horse guts. This overlap of events perfectly embodies what Innocent is all about.